Welcome to the Deck Dive. Today, we're taking a really close look at the Indian defense industry.
Yeah, it's a sector that's definitely hitting an inflection point.
Absolutely. It's going through this huge transformation, and, its strategic importance for India just seems to be growing daily.
It really is.
So our mission here is to kind of pull out the most important nuggets, the key insights from all the material we've looked at.
Right, give you a shortcut to getting up to speed.
Exactly, a fast track on this really dynamic sector. And hopefully, spark some of those aha moments for you.
Hmm.
We're going to unpack things like government support, the demand picture, those big policy
And the
changes.
dual role it plays, right?
Mhm.
Security, but also high-tech manufacturing.
Precisely. Okay, so let's start unpacking. Our sources, they're showing a pretty significant surge in valuations, earnings too, especially for the defense public sector undertakings, the DPSUs.
Yeah, that's quite visible.
What exactly is fueling all this buoyancy right now?
Well, it's really a mix of things coming together. You've got, obviously, strong government backing.
Okay.
Then there's the increasing demand from the armed forces themselves. They need to modernize.
Makes sense.
And then, crucially, a whole series of policy reforms that have actually had teeth.
Mm.
We're also seeing, more private sector players getting involved, which is interesting. And defense exports are starting to show some encouraging signs,
Well,
too.
so this re-rating of defense stocks, it's not just hype.
No, not at all. I mean, it seems like a direct result of deliberate policy shifts.
Yep.
You have to look at the Defense Acquisition Procedure 2020, DAP 2020,
All right, that comes up a lot.
because it's key. It's essentially assured order flows, and it's created this, well, protected ecosystem for domestic companies, especially those DPSUs.
Okay, so we see the immediate drivers, but this transformation, it's bigger than just the financials, isn't it? How does this defense manufacturing push fit into India's wider goals, like beyond just security?
Yeah, that's the crucial connection.
Mm.
If you look at the bigger picture, defense is critical for any country wanting to build up, high technology manufacturing.
Wait, that industrial base.
Exactly. And for India, with its, let's say, complex neighborhood,
Mm.
it's even more of a strategic imperative. So
Yeah.
you get this dual benefit, national security, and boosting the economy through high-tech manufacturing.
So that guarantees continued focus.
It strongly suggests that, yeah, it means defense is likely to stay a high priority for government support, for capital allocation.
Yeah.
That gives you a sort of long-term fundamental driver for growth in the sector.
It's not just about buying weapons.
No, it's about building the capability to build them and everything that comes with that.
Okay, this is where, for me, it got really interesting, the geopolitical angle.
Mm-hmm.
These global shifts, regional stuff, it's not just background noise. It seems like it's directly shaping India's defense spending.
Wow.
What are the big international forces at play here?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a major factor. Look, the main thing you can't ignore is China's military buildup. It's been incredibly aggressive.
The spending numbers are huge, right?
They are. Their military spending grew something like 12% CAGR between 2000 and 2023. That's more than double the U.S. rate over the same time.
Wow.
And it's not just quantity, it's the quality leap. The PLAAF, their Air Force, has about 1,600 aircraft now.
And lots of modern ones.
Yeah, about 68% are fourth or four plus generation.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, they're only the second Air Force, globally, to field fifth-gen fighters, the J-20, the SC-31, or J-35.
That changes the whole equation for India.
Completely.
Yeah.
India has to think differently about air defense,
Yeah.
maybe more asymmetric capabilities, tech parity in specific areas, not just matching numbers.
And what about the maritime picture? There was mention of the U.S. role changing.
Right. There's this view that U.S. ambitions as a global sea power might be waning a bit, partly because they're more oil self-sufficient now.
Right.
But China, still heavily reliant on sea-imported fuels. So the burden falls on China to keep those sea lanes open.
And many run through the Indian Ocean.
Exactly.
Right.
Which means India needs significant naval and air power just to counter a much more sophisticated Chinese presence right in its backyard.
And then there are the regional neighbors.
Can't forget those. You've still got the enduring concern about extremism, plus nuclear-armed Pakistan. And China actively uses Pakistan as a sort of counterbalance. They arm Pakistan with advanced systems, J-10 fighters, maybe even the J-35 down the line.
Which means India has to plan for.
A potential two-front conflict scenario.
Yeah.
Which is, frankly, a daunting prospect for any military planner.
A lot to handle. So given all that, how is India approaching warfare now? Are they learning from conflicts elsewhere?
Definitely. You see insights from places like Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, Israel filtering into their modernization plans.
Like what specifically?
A big emphasis on asymmetric warfare. Drones, unmanned systems, cyber information warfare, that whole domain.
So less reactive, more proactive.
That seems to be the direction,
Yeah.
yes. It signals this sustained, long-term need for modernization, for upgrading capabilities across the board. It's not a short-term thing.
And you mentioned export opportunities earlier.
Yeah, that's another interesting angle. These global realignments, like the sort of widening gap between the U.S. and some European allies,
Okay.
and the calls for Europe to rearm, that actually creates a potential opening for India.
To sell to Europe.
Potentially, yeah. To contribute to scaling up European defense capabilities. It could position India, alongside maybe China, as a significant defense supplier globally. That's a big shift.
A huge strategic and economic opportunity then.
If they can seize it, yes.
Okay, we've got the pressures, the policy shifts, but let's talk about the money. How is India actually funding this? What's the history of their defense budget, and what are the current trends telling us?
Right. The budget story is revealing. Historically, since the 60s, defense spending pretty much tracked GDP growth. About 6.6% CAGR for defense versus 7.2% for GDP.
Okay, roughly in line.
But then, after the economic liberalization in the early 90s, defense spending as a share of GDP actually dropped quite a bit. Went from around 4% down to about 2.5%.
And spending was often reactive?
Historically, yes. Often triggered by specific events rather than long-term planning.
So what about now? Is it going up again?
Well, in absolute terms, yes, the total expenditure has increased. But interestingly, as a percentage of total government spending, it's actually trended downward slightly.
Really?
Yeah, from maybe 16% back in 2013-14 down to around 14% in the budget estimate for 2025-26.
Huh. And non-pension spending?
Also trending down slightly as a percentage of GDP, around 1.5% currently.
That's fascinating. So if the overall share isn't dramatically increasing, what's the biggest squeeze on the budget? Where's the constraint?
Ah, that's the core issue. The analysis is pretty clear. Over half the defense budget gets eaten up by salaries and pensions.
Over half. Wow.
Yeah, and that massively constrains what's left for R&D and for modernization. Big time.
What about schemes like Agnipath? Weren't they meant to help with that?
They were intended to, yes. But the reports suggest they haven't been quite as successful in reducing those legacy costs as hoped, at least not yet. It's a systemic challenge.
So how does that pension burden affect modernization spending across the different services?
Well, it means the capital budget, the money for new kit, is under pressure, and the split is quite stark. The Army gets the biggest overall budget slice,
Right.
but only gets about 10–15% of the actual modernization budget.
Only 10–15%. Where does the rest go?
The Navy and the Air Force basically split the remaining 90% pretty evenly.
Why such a difference?
It reflects the much higher cost of their platforms.
Yeah.
Fighter jets, warships, submarines, and also, perhaps, the strategic focus on those capabilities for future power projection.
And R&D spending within all this.
That's another critical point. Overall R&D spending, persistently low. It stays below 5% of the total defense budget.
Below 5%.
Yeah. And this isn't just a random number. There's a causal link here. Because the budget is so constrained, especially by personnel costs, it forces a strategic reliance on the private sector for innovation. They simply don't have enough in the state budget for cutting-edge R&D at the scale needed.
So the future of innovation isn't just DRDO anymore.
Increasingly, no. It has to involve private enterprise in a much bigger way.
Right. That's a powerful point, the private sector needing to fill that innovation gap.
Right.
So let's talk policy. What are the key things enabling this? We keep hearing about DIP 2020. How exactly was that such a game changer for bringing in private players?
DIP 2020 was genuinely transformative. Its core principle is mandating procurement of systems that are Indian designed, developed, and manufactured, the IDDM category.
Right, make in India.
Exactly.
Right.
And that mandate has just energized the whole sector because it provides assured order flows. Plus, you have these positive indigenization lists.
What are those?
Basically, lists of equipment and platforms that must be sourced domestically.
Right.
And these lists keep expanding.
Ah, so it creates a guaranteed market.
Precisely. It fundamentally de-risks R&D investment for private companies. They now have policy certainty that if they develop something the forces need, there's a protected market for it. The old fear of being orphaned by imports is reduced.
And this is creating a new kind of structure, like different tiers of companies.
Yeah, you're seeing a tiered ecosystem emerge. You have the big DPSUs often acting as lead integrators,
Okay.
but increasingly supported by large private conglomerates. Think Tata, Adani, L&T, Mahindra.
Right.
And then below them, a growing layer of smaller private firms acting as suppliers for components, subsystems. It's becoming a more complex, hopefully more robust supply chain.
That brings up the DRDO again, the Defense Research and Development Organization. What is happening with its role? Is it just fading away as the private sector steps up?
Not fading away entirely, but definitely a changing role. We're
Yeah.
seeing what looks like an anticipated waning influence, maybe some consolidation.
Okay.
The main point is the onus for R&D is shifting quite significantly towards the private sector.
And DAP 2020 helps that shift.
Massively. Those indigenization lists give the private sector the confidence, the policy certainty, to actually invest their own capital in defense tech development. It's less reliant on DRDO initiating everything.
So it's not a full handoff, but a rebalancing.
A significant rebalancing, yeah. The private sector is now viewed, I think, as a primary engine for innovation, especially cutting-edge stuff.
Can you give examples of projects where this is visible?
Sure. Ambitious programs like the AMCA, the Advanced Medium Combat Aircraft, the indigenous Zora War light tanks, lots happening in cybersecurity, developing indigenous communication protocols.
Uh-huh.
And specifically, look out for Make 1 and 2 projects. Make 1 is government-funded R&D, Make 2 is industry-funded, both with assured orders if successful. These are seen as key growth areas for next-gen systems.
So the outlook seems pretty positive.
Collectively, yeah, it paints a pretty rosy picture for the sector and the private companies involved.
And exports are part of that rosy picture.
They have to be, long-term. We talked about the geopolitical drivers, the Russia-Ukraine situation, U.S.-Europe shifts, European rearmament.
Right.
All that positions India, potentially, as a significant defense supplier globally. It's crucial for diversifying revenue beyond just the domestic MOVID budget.
Okay, let's zoom in on the companies then. Who's actually benefiting? The data shows DPSUs becoming, quote, growth stars. Got any specifics?
Absolutely. Take Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, HAL. Before DFP 2020, their profit after tax CAGR was maybe 4%. Post-DFP, it jumped to 22%.
Wow, that's a big jump.
Huge. And their return on capital employed, ROCE, also improved from about 25% to 30%. Fraud Electronics, BOEL, is another one. PAT CAGR went from 12% pre-DAP to 29% post-DAP. ROCE is strong too, around 29%.
So HAL went from being just a steady dividend payer.
Yeah, it was seen as a kind of high ROCE cash cow, but not much growth. No, it looks like a genuine growth story. And it's largely down to those assured orders from the government mandates.
But it can't be the same story for private companies, can it? What are the differences? What challenges do they face that maybe the DPSUs don't?
No, it's definitely a different dynamic. Look, the DPSUs have these built-in advantages, right?
Like access to DRDO.
Access to DRDO R&D, often better payment terms, upfront advances sometimes, priority during inspections. So their order flow and growth, pretty much underwritten by the government.
Okay. And private players?
For them, while orders are increasing too, the real challenge is balancing that growth with maintaining high returns, particularly high ROCE.
Why is that harder for them?
They have to be much more careful about managing growth, their R&D spending, which projects they pick. It requires, more judicious management.
Is there one specific big challenge?
I'd say the big one is what gets called the working capital trap.
Working capital trap. Explain that.
Okay, so for many private defense firms, over 80% of their capital employed can get tied up in working capital.
80%. In
Right.
what?
Mostly inventory, building things up before they get paid. And it gets worse because of long inspection times before dispatch.
Delays.
Right. And also substantial bank guarantee requirements.
Yeah.
They have to lock up cash for those guarantees. All of this just weighs down their ROCE.
So it's tough to grow fast and be highly profitable.
It's a real balancing act. It almost acts like a natural selection process, The companies that figure out how to manage their cash cycles better, maybe through modular production or negotiating faster payments, they're the ones who will likely outperform.
So if you're an investor looking at this sector, DPSUs versus private.
Well, the DPSUs look like a safer bet for policy-backed growth, given the assured orders.
Okay.
Private companies need a much more discerning bottom-up approach.
Right.
You really have to look for companies with genuine, innovative capability, ones that own technology or critical manufacturing know-how.
And strong management.
Absolutely strong promoters who can navigate those tricky operational complexities, especially the working capital side.
And what about exports for the private players? How important is that long term?
Critically important. Right now, most revenue is domestic, obviously, but ramping up exports is essential for the whole sector's maturity, but especially for private firms.
Why especially them?
It allows them to diversify away from relying solely on the Indian MOD. It brings economies of scale, forces continuous innovation to stay competitive globally. Success internationally will be a key differentiator for sustained high growth and profitability. That's where they can really stand out.
Okay, fascinating dynamics, but no sector is risk-free. What are the big hurdles or challenges someone watching this space needs to keep an eye on?
Well, the geopolitical risks we discussed are ongoing. China's continued military growth, the arming of Pakistan creating that potential two-front issue,
Right.
and the more sophisticated Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. Those are constant strategic challenges.
What about operational risks inside India?
Yeah, those still exist.
Yeah.
Procurement delays historically have been a problem. Processes can still stretch out, 2, 3 years from request for proposal to actually getting final payment.
That's a long time.
It is. And there are issues like funds lapsing if yearly delivery targets aren't met. Creates inefficiencies.
And technology gaps, R&D.
Still a concern. That low R&D spending figure, below 5%, is persistent. DRDO has had past struggles with speed and agility. And another practical issue is foreign suppliers, even partners like Israeli firms, being reluctant to share source codes or allow field repairs. That hampers deeper indigenous capability and maintenance.
Right, that dependence lingers.
It does. And then for the private companies specifically, those execution risks are key. The high working capital intensity we talked about.
That trap again.
Yeah. And just the difficulty of balancing fast growth with high ROCE because of inventory and those bank guarantees. It's a constant pressure.
So, pulling it all together for an investor, what are the actionable takeaways? What themes should they focus on?
Okay, key themes would be, 1, indigenization. That's the core mandate driving everything.
Got it.
2, the shift of R&D towards the private sector. That's where a lot of future value creation might lie.
Okay.
3, deep modernization and upgrades, especially for the Navy and Air Force. Lots happening in electronics, systems integration. And 4, the rise of the information-driven battle space. Think cyber, C4ISR, unmanned systems. High-tech areas.
And what specific things should you monitor?
Definitely company-specific growth in that ROCE number. Order book visibility, how much work they have secured and how well they're executing on
All
it.
right.
R&D spend and actual innovation output. Are they creating valuable IP? Working capital management, especially inventory levels. Are they keeping it under control?
Exports.
Export revenue growth, absolutely crucial long-term. And keep an eye on government budget allocations, specifically the capital outlay for modernization.
Any areas to avoid?
The advice seems to be, avoid things like offsets or other low-value-add businesses. Focus on core technology and manufacturing know-how.
Okay, that was incredibly thorough. A real deep dive. We've seen this sector is just undergoing massive change. Government mandates, geopolitics, a whole industrial shift.
Yeah, it's a confluence of powerful forces.
What's really hitting me about this is you see this nation's complex history with its military colliding with these intense modern pressures, and it's fundamentally reshaping an entire industry. It's creating opportunities that, you just wouldn't have imagined maybe a decade ago. It's this blend of security needs and economic ambition.
It really is, and if you connect it to that bigger picture. Look, the journey for India's defense sector, it feels like it's truly just begun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's positioning India not just for its own security, but potentially as a serious global player in defense manufacturing and supply. The real challenge now, maybe the alpha for investors, is finding those private sector innovators who can consistently blend that cutting-edge tech with solid execution and, crucially, financial discipline in this evolving landscape. That's the tricky part.
A fascinating challenge. Well, we definitely encourage you, the listener, to keep exploring the implications here. Think about how this push for making things in India, this export ambition, how might that change global defense supply chains, maybe even regional power balances in the years ahead?
Yeah, it's a story that's definitely still unfolding.
Absolutely. Lots to watch.